When you've lost everything, sometimes the only thing left to do is survive. But what if survival doesn't mean going it alone? The wind in the Montana wilderness doesn't whisper, it howls, especially in the months after grief. James Whitaker knew that sound too well. It had become the soundtrack to his life since his wife passed away the previous winter, taking with her not just laughter and warmth, but also any semblance of direction. Their cabin, once a shared dream nestled deep among pine and aspen, had become a mausoleum of silence. He had retreated to this place not to find peace, but to disappear. Every cup of coffee he brewed, every creaky floorboard underfoot, echoed memories that wouldn't leave him be. Even his dog Charlie, an aging golden retriever who had once been their shared companion, was gone now, succumbing to old age just weeks after James had buried his wife. Grief didn't just take, it erased. And James had let it. That spring, a letter arrived from an old friend who ran the Wild Heart Rescue Center 3 towns over. It was a short note, handwritten, with one line underlined. "We've got a young bobcat here raised by a retriever. She thinks she's a dog." James almost laughed. Almost. The absurdity of it tugged at something half asleep inside him. He ignored it for 3 days. Then, on the 4th, with nothing better to do than stare at the fire and remember things he didn't want to, he drove. The rescue center was a modest place, an old barn converted into pens and shaded enclosures. The animals were mostly recovering from human negligence, hit by cars, orphaned, or illegally kept as pets. But when he saw the bobcat, standing quietly in a corner of her enclosure with one paw wrapped around a ratty tennis ball, James stopped walking. "She doesn't hiss," said Margot, the woman who ran the place. "Doesn't hide either. Grew up with a retriever named Bella. The owners were forced to surrender her after a complaint. She fetches, begs, tries to wag her tail, but can't quite manage it." James looked again. The bobcat wasn't pacing like the others. She was watching him, not with fear, not even curiosity, just openness, like she was waiting. "She doesn't do well in cages," Margot added quietly. "She needs a real place, somewhere quiet, and someone patient." James didn't say yes, not out loud, but he didn't walk away either. He came looking for nothing, but what he found was something wild and something lost, just like him. The first few days back at the cabin were strange. The bobcat, he named her Lyra, paced the walls as if taking inventory. She sniffed old rugs, pawed at doorknobs, and curled up on the couch as if it had always belonged to her. She didn't meow, didn't growl either, but she made odd little chirps when she wanted attention. And she carried things, socks, leaves, a stick from outside, like offerings. The first time she nudged an old tennis ball at his foot, James nearly cried. At night, she would hop onto the end of his bed and curl into a ball, tail twitching with dreams. He started leaving the door open during the day. She never wandered far, always came back when he called, which he never expected to work. But somehow, she listened. Neighbors, those who still checked in occasionally, thought he was crazy. "That thing's a wild animal," one had said. "She's gonna turn on you someday." But James had lived through worse than claws. He saw something familiar in Lyra, a gentleness forged in the wrong world. She didn't quite belong to nature anymore, and certainly not to humans. She was a creature suspended between instincts and upbringing, just like him, caught between who he used to be and who he had to become. Over time, their routines aligned. James began writing again, nothing structured, just thoughts. Lyra would lie near the fireplace while he scribbled notes on old envelopes and yellow pads. She liked to watch birds, but never chase them. And sometimes, in the dead still of night, she would howl, not a cry of fear, but a call, as if searching for someone she hadn't yet met. One morning, after a fresh snowfall, James stepped out to find Lyra bounding through the drifts with a joy that shocked him. Her paws barely touched the ground as she leapt and spun, a streak of warm amber against the frozen white. He laughed out loud, a real chest-deep laugh that startled even him. Lyra stopped, turned, and trotted back to him, tail twitching like a wag, her breath fogging in the air between them. She dropped the tennis ball at his boots, looking up with wide, golden eyes. And in that moment, James realized he had lost his wife, his dog, his purpose. But in a wild creature who thought she was a retriever, he found a reason to begin again. By the end of that first month, Lyra knew every inch of the cabin, and James had started rewriting the pages of his own life, this time not out of duty or grief, but with hope. Not hope that things would go back to the way they were, but hope that even the most broken things could be rearranged into something new, something wild, something beautiful, something worth holding on to. He wasn't alone, not anymore. You don't just move on from loss. Sometimes you grow something around it, something unexpected and tender. The morning after Lyra brought him the tennis ball, James found himself staring at it for a long time, turning it over in his hands like an artifact from a forgotten life. The felt was chewed through, one side nearly flat, yet it held more warmth than anything else in the house. He placed it carefully on the mantel, beside a faded photograph of Charlie, his old golden retriever. The gesture wasn't symbolic at first, but something about it lingered. It was the first time in over a year he had touched that photo. Lyra watched him do it, her head tilted slightly, those amber eyes focused and unblinking. She had a way of observing that made James feel like she understood more than a bobcat should. Their days began to take on shape, quiet but full. James would rise before dawn, make coffee, and crack open the windows to let in the clean mountain air. Lyra would be waiting on the porch, ears twitching, her breath rising in soft clouds. They'd walk together, James crunching through pine needles and frost, Lyra weaving silently in and out of the trees, never straying far. She'd learned to stay close. He had learned not to fear silence. The cabin, once dark and musty, began to breathe again. James repaired the broken porch step, oiled the hinges, replaced old dusty curtains with light ones his wife had packed away years ago. The smell of pine and bread baking filled the rooms again. He played old vinyls on the turntable, something he hadn't touched since the funeral, and Lyra would curl up beneath the table, her tail flicking in time to the soft music. It wasn't healing in the way people described it. It was more like remembering how to live without a map, and Lyra was the compass. They weren't rescuing each other. They were simply choosing each other, day by day, step by careful step. One Sunday afternoon, while organizing boxes in the attic, James found his wife's old camera, dusty but still functional. On a whim, he brought it down and began taking photos, mostly of Lyra. She didn't mind. She'd strike poses without knowing it, perched on the woodpile, curled like smoke on the windowsill, mid-leap in the snowy yard. He printed a few and pinned them above his desk. And that's when the idea came to him. What if he documented this, not just for himself, but for others? There was something about Lyra that tugged at something universal: grief, resilience, unlikely companionship. A bobcat that chased sticks and guarded her human like a loyal dog. He started writing in earnest again. Mornings became sacred writing hours. Lyra would sit nearby or bat a ball across the room while he typed. He called the memoir Where the Wild Waits, and the early chapters practically wrote themselves. The story wasn't just about Lyra. It was about a man trying to hold on to something human in the face of overwhelming loss, and a creature who had no reason to trust people, yet chose to anyway. James sent the first few chapters to an old editor friend in Missoula, not expecting much. But 2 weeks later, she called. "James, this is something special." And just like that, a story once buried in silence began to echo far beyond the mountains. Meanwhile, Lyra became something of a local legend. Word got around. A man in the mountains living with a bobcat that played fetch and followed voice commands. A wildlife photographer from Bozeman reached out, asking if he could visit. James declined, politely, but posted a few photos online under a pseudonym. Within a month, the account had thousands of followers. Comments poured in. "This saved my morning. My son just lost his dog, and your story gave him hope. I didn't think I could smile again. Then I found your page." James didn't know what to do with all the attention. He wasn't looking to go viral, but it felt good to know Lyra's story, their story, was helping others. So he kept sharing. He posted about Lyra's quirks, how she loved to lick the condensation off windows, how she tried to bury her treats in the couch cushions, how she would paw at the radio until he found the jazz station she liked. It was silly and simple, but people responded. Then came the letters. One arrived from a woman in Oregon whose teenage daughter refused to leave her room after a traumatic loss until she saw Lyra's videos. Another from a veteran in Texas who wrote, "If a wild thing like her can learn to love again, maybe I can too." James started to understand something he hadn't before. What he and Lyra shared wasn't just companionship, it was permission for others to hope again, to believe in things they thought were lost forever. Sometimes, it's the most unexpected creatures who remind us what it means to be alive. That summer, the wild here. Center invited James and Lyra to a small outdoor event. No press, just a few families and donors. James was hesitant, worried the attention might frighten Lyra or set her back. But Margot assured him, "There's a little girl here who used to take naps with Lyra when she was a kitten. She's been asking for her every week." The little girl's name was Sophie. She had spent weeks in foster care while her parents battled for custody, and in that stretch of limbo, Lyra had been her only anchor. James watched from a distance as Sophie approached cautiously, holding a frayed tennis ball. Lyra looked up from her perch and trotted over, nuzzling the child like an old friend. There wasn't a dry eye in the circle. Back home that evening, James added a new line to his memoir. Love doesn't ask for species or history. It simply finds the ones who need it most. Lyra curled at his feet, a soft snore escaping her chest. Outside, the forest sang its usual nighttime chorus. But for the first time in years, James didn't feel alone in the sound. He felt held by it. What they were building wasn't just a home. It was a sanctuary, for grief, for healing, for wildness that refused to be tamed. By summer's end, Lyra had claimed every part of the cabin, its porch, its fireplace, its quiet hours. And James had begun to believe that maybe, just maybe, this second chapter of life was meant to be written with paw prints in the margins. Together, they were no longer just surviving. They were learning how to live again. The seasons shifted slowly in the mountains, like someone turning the pages of an old, beloved book. The forest began to glow with the amber and gold of autumn. Mornings were cooler now, the air crisp and edged with frost. Lyra took to sleeping closer to the fireplace, her breath curling like smoke against James's wool socks. The memoir was nearly finished. James had spent weeks polishing each chapter, layering the pages not just with words, but with years of grief, quiet healing, and the small miracles that came from choosing love again. It wasn't just a book about a bobcat or a man. It was about the space between, about what happens when a lost heart finds something equally untamed and yet endlessly loyal. But even as the last words settled into place, life around them was still growing, still changing. One afternoon, as James returned from collecting firewood, he saw a familiar car pulling up the gravel path. He recognized the woman before she even stepped out. It was Claire, Sophie's mother. She waved, her smile warm, a little nervous. "I hope this isn't a bad time," she said. "Not at all," James replied, brushing off his hands. "What brings you all the way out here?" Claire looked down at her daughter, who stepped shyly from the car, holding something behind her back. "We thought maybe Lyra might want this," Sophie said. From behind her, she revealed the same tennis ball, the one Lyra had played with as a kitten. James felt something stir in his chest. The little girl held it like it was treasure. Lyra, as if on cue, appeared from the trees. She didn't bound forward the way a dog might, but her body language softened. She circled the girl, tail low, then gently took the ball from her outstretched hand. "She remembered," Sophie whispered, eyes wide with wonder. James invited them in. They stayed for tea and cinnamon bread, and it turned into a long, easy afternoon. Lyra settled between them, occasionally nudging Sophie's feet or licking crumbs from her fingers. Before they left, Claire turned to James, her expression more serious. "I've been thinking," she said, "maybe others could benefit from this, not just reading about it, seeing it. Maybe it's time Lyra's story reaches more people." James hesitated. He didn't want to turn Lyra into a spectacle. She was a companion, not a symbol. Claire seemed to read his thoughts. Not like a show, more like a way to educate, to help kids like Sophie understand animals, grief, resilience. James mulled it over after they left. That night, he watched Lyra sleep, curled tightly by the hearth. What they had was rare, sacred even, but if sharing it could bring someone else even a sliver of peace, wasn't that a kind of giving back? A week later, James contacted Margot at the Wild Heart Center. They arranged a series of low-key, community-based talks. No press, just small gatherings where James would read excerpts from his memoir and talk about Lyra. They called it Wild Bonds, Lessons from the Edge of Grief. Margot suggested they bring Lyra, but James knew better. She wasn't made for crowds. Instead, he brought photos and videos. Some showed Lyra napping beside his writing desk. Others captured her playing fetch in the golden field behind the cabin, or rubbing her face against his coat like a house cat. The first event was at a small library in Helena. Barely 30 people attended, but the questions afterward lasted nearly 2 hours. How do you gain a wild animal's trust? What do you do when people say it's unnatural? Was it grief that connected you? James answered honestly. Sometimes he didn't have an answer at all, and that too was its own kind of truth. On the way home, he stopped by the edge of the forest where Lyra liked to sit. He crouched down, letting the silence stretch. Then, from between the trees, she appeared, slipping out of the shadows like smoke. She rubbed her side against him once before settling at his feet. No leash, no collar. Just trust. They sat there as the sun went down, the sky bruising purple and red behind the mountains. It reminded James of something he once read, that animals don't grieve the way we do, but they do remember. They carry loss in their own way. And Lyra had carried hers straight into his broken heart. That winter, the snows came early. Deep drifts blanketed the hills, and the sky stayed gray for weeks at a time. But the cabin stayed warm. James worked on a second book, more personal essays this time. Lyra kept him company, as always, her presence a grounding heartbeat in the quiet space. The online community continued to grow. Emma, a young wildlife blogger who had written about them after the library event, reached out asking to visit. She wasn't just a journalist. She was starting a foundation focused on raising awareness about unconventional bonds in the animal kingdom. James liked her immediately. She was thoughtful, asked permission before every photo, and respected Lyra's boundaries. Over hot cocoa one evening, she said, "You and Lyra, you've rewritten the rulebook on grief, and maybe on love too." James laughed softly. "We're just two lost things that found each other." Emma looked around the room, at the photos, at the warmth. "Well, whatever it is, it's working." After she left, James stood by the window long after the taillights disappeared into the night. Lyra pressed her nose to the glass beside him, watching, as if she too understood that something had shifted again, that their story was no longer just theirs. It had grown into something larger, something communal. They had built a life not by returning to the past, but by honoring it, and by opening their door, not too wide, just enough, for others to feel its warmth. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Lyra turned away from the window and leapt onto the couch beside him, placing her head against his shoulder. James didn't speak. He just rested his hand on her fur, and together they listened to the wilderness call, not as something to fear, but as a song they had both come to understand. The days grew longer again, and with spring came a kind of awakening, not just in the forest, but in James too. He'd lived through the long quiet of winter, held close by Lyra's companionship and the soft cadence of writing. The snow melted slowly from the mountainsides, revealing patches of green and the soft pulse of a world ready to bloom again. It was during one of those slow thaws in late March that Emma returned, this time not alone. She brought her parents John and Teresa, who'd supported her foundation from the beginning, and wanted to meet the man and the animal who had quietly sparked an entire movement. Lyra was cautious at first. She didn't approach strangers easily anymore, not the way she had as a cub. But something about Teresa, in particular, made her pause. The woman crouched low, palms open and voice gentle. Lyra didn't come forward, but she didn't disappear either. She watched, golden eyes blinking slowly, the way a creature does when it's still deciding. They stayed for the weekend. James showed them the trails where he and Lyra walked most evenings, and the boulder where she liked to sun herself, front paws stretched forward like a sleepy lioness. In the evenings, they talked around the fireplace. "You've made something rare here," John said, sipping his tea. "Not just with Lyra, with all of this." James shrugged, but there was a quiet pride in his chest. He looked at Lyra, curled up near the fire, tail twitching gently in her sleep. Emma leaned forward, excitement shining in her eyes. "We've been thinking about expanding the foundation into education, not just awareness, actual programs, outdoor learning, grief therapy through animal connection, maybe even retreats here in Montana." James hesitated. "I've never run anything like that." "You already are," Emma replied. "Every letter you get from a child, every story you've told, people don't just read them, they feel them. You've made a space that teaches without even trying. That night, James stayed up after everyone had gone to bed. He sat on the porch with a blanket draped over his shoulders, notebook in his lap. Lyra joined him after a while, brushing against his leg before settling close. He didn't write anything. He just listened to the night, to the whisper of wind through pine, to the steady breath of the bobcat beside him. By summer, the first small group had arrived. 3 families, all with children who had experienced recent losses. One boy had lost a sibling, another his father. The third, a girl named Ivy, had watched her house burn down, her dog trapped inside. James wasn't a therapist. He didn't try to be. He simply showed them the land, invited them to help in the garden, told stories in the evenings, some about Lyra, others about grief, that reshaped itself into something gentler over time. Lyra never let any of them touch her, but she was there, always, watching, present. When Ivy cried one night, curled in a rocking chair with her knees to her chest, it was Lyra who padded silently up to her and lay down nearby. Not touching, but close enough that Ivy could feel her warmth. "She came to me," Ivy whispered the next morning. "She didn't say anything, but I heard her." James didn't ask what she meant. He'd learned by then that children understood things adults often couldn't explain. Later that summer, Emma returned with her parents and a young man named Caleb, John and Teresa's son, Emma's older brother. Caleb wasn't there to talk about programs or foundations. He was quiet, a carpenter by trade, and had come simply because he was curious. But over the course of a few visits, he and James began restoring the old shed near the cabin, turning it into a small reading room for visitors. James found Caleb easy to be around. They didn't talk much at first, but there was a comfort in shared work, the rhythm of hammers, the smell of sawdust, the way Lyra sometimes slunk in to nap on the tools, completely unbothered by noise. One morning, while fitting shelves into place, Caleb asked, "Do you think she knows she's not a dog?" James chuckled. "I think she knows she's not only a bobcat." That became something of a private joke between them. Not only a bobcat, not only a man, not only anything really. By fall, more families had come. The property began to change, not drastically, but thoughtfully. A few additional cabins were added, tucked away so as not to disturb the natural rhythms of the land. Paths were widened just enough for wheelchairs. James insisted the quiet spaces remain untouched, the porch swing, the wildflower hill, the stone where Lyra liked to sit at dusk. And through it all, Lyra stayed the same. She aged slowly, her coat still sleek, her spirit steady. But there was something quieter about her now. She no longer pounced on butterflies or chased squirrels through the underbrush. She watched more than she moved, and always she returned to James. One night, after the last family of the season had left and the frost returned to the edges of the windows, James lay on the floor beside the fireplace, staring at the ceiling. Lyra lay next to him, her chin resting on his shoulder. "Do you ever wonder," he murmured, "if any of this was meant to happen?" She didn't answer, of course, but her tail thumped softly against his side. The next day a package arrived. Inside was a leather-bound copy of his memoir, now published, now real, with a foreword written by Emma and a small note tucked inside. For the ones who found family when they thought they had none left. James sat on the porch with the book in his lap, Lyra beside him. He didn't cry, he simply closed his eyes and let the wind move through him like breath. They'd made something that would last longer than either of them. Not just a home, not just a story, but a place where grief turned to growth, where a bobcat who played fetch could change hearts, where a man who had once stopped believing in belonging finally found a way back. All because 2 broken things had decided not to run from each other, but to stay. The first snow fell earlier than expected that year, blanketing the Montana hillside in silence. James woke to find the porch covered in frost and the pine trees bowed under the soft weight of winter's return. He let the fire crackle to life in the wood stove and stood for a long time by the window, watching as Lyra sat just beyond the glass, her paws tucked under her chest, perfectly still except for the slow flick of her tail. She was aging now, more visibly than before. The grace of her movements remained, but there was a deeper stillness in her, like the mountain itself, solid and watching. James felt it too, not just the passage of time, but its echo in their bodies. Where once he might have cleared the paths of snow before breakfast, now he took his time, and Lyra followed more slowly, choosing the shorter trails instead of the full loops. The guest cabins remained quiet through the heart of winter, though Emma visited when she could. She brought books and small comforts, stories from the outside world. Her parents had slowed down too. John's knee surgeries and Teresa's forgetfulness meant they now helped from afar, focusing more on fundraising and the foundation's educational arm. Caleb came up more often in their stead. He had built a small studio behind the reading shed and spent his nights carving sculptures of the forest animals. A fox here, a moose there, but always one piece of Lyra, her stretch in mid-leap, the tilt of her head, the arch of her tail. By early January, Lyra began to refuse food some mornings. James tried not to worry, knowing animals had their own rhythms, but he also knew her too well. There was a new weight to her sleep, and sometimes, when she stared out at the woods, she didn't seem to be looking at them, but through them, as if seeing something beyond the trees. He called Emma just to talk. "She's slowing down," he admitted. Emma was quiet a moment, then gently, "Maybe she's teaching you something again, about how to let go." James closed his eyes. "I'm not ready. No one ever is." For the next few weeks, James gave Lyra everything she wanted. He cooked fresh chicken and fish, even when she only sniffed at it. He cleared paths to her favorite spots. Some nights she wanted to be near the fire, curled up beside him on the rug. Other nights, she'd disappear for hours and return just before dawn, paws dusted with snow, eyes reflecting stars. Then one morning, she didn't return at all. James searched the forest until dusk, calling her name softly, as he had the first time she ran off so long ago. He checked all the usual places, the sunning rock, the boulder near the stream, the hilltop clearing. Nothing, no tracks, no movement, only the hush of winter settling deeper into the land. He built a fire outside that night and sat beside it with a blanket and an old sweater she used to nap on. He left the cabin door open, a soft lamp glowing inside. But the hours passed, and Lyra did not come back. It wasn't until the third day, when James stood beneath the clearing sky at dawn, that he saw her. She was curled under the overhang of a fallen tree, just past the ridge, barely visible against the frost. She lifted her head when he approached, but didn't rise. Her breathing was slow, but steady. Her eyes met his, calm, deep, knowing. He didn't speak. He simply sat beside her. They stayed like that for hours. When he reached out, she pressed her head into his hand, a gesture of absolute trust. And then, as the sun dipped low behind the ridge, Lyra let out one long, quiet breath and did not take another. James didn't cry at first. He stayed there beside her until the stars returned, the cold seeping into his bones, the silence swallowing the forest. He buried her at the foot of the sunning rock, where she had once sprawled belly up in the heat of summer. Caleb carved a wooden marker, simple and elegant. Lyra, more than wild, more than tame, family. The foundation paused operations for a few weeks. Emma handled most of the outreach. Letters poured in, hundreds. Some from people who had met Lyra, others who only knew her from James's writing. One woman wrote, "I never met her, but she helped me say goodbye to my father. Somehow, knowing she existed gave me peace." James returned to writing, but it came slowly. Some days he just sat on the porch, mug of tea cooling in his hands, watching the place she used to wait for him each morning. Grief, he realized, wasn't something to survive. It was something to grow around, like trees curving around a fallen log. One morning in April, James woke to find a small shape curled on the porch. At first, he thought it was a fox, but as he stepped closer, the animal raised its head, young, alert, and unmistakably a bobcat. Not Lyra. This one was smaller, thinner, its eyes a darker shade, with a nicked ear and cautious step. He didn't approach. He simply opened the door and left a bowl of water and a few scraps of food nearby. The bobcat didn't touch it that day, but the next morning, it was gone. Over the next week, the young bobcat came and went. Never close, never tame, but always watching. James didn't try to name her. He didn't need to. He understood now that Lyra had been a once-in-a-lifetime soul. But maybe, just maybe, grief left behind something too. A kind of trail for others to follow, a soft imprint in the snow. Months passed, then a full year. The foundation grew stronger, the retreat center expanded, and new families continued to come. Some left rocks or feathers at Lyra's resting place. Others planted wildflowers nearby. James wrote a second book, less memoir, more meditation on grief, nature, and the mysterious ways love returned to us, again and again, often in forms we didn't expect. On the final page, he wrote, "She taught me that not everything broken needs fixing. Some things are meant to stay wild, some grief is meant to be carried, and some love, if you're lucky, comes back. Not the same, but still somehow yours." One evening, as twilight deepened and the stars blinked through the trees, James sat by the fire, book in hand, heart quieter now. The young bobcat lingered at the edge of the woods, just watching. James raised his cup slightly in salute. He didn't call to her. He didn't need to. She was there. That was enough.